Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about local election preparations, but happening also in the region was the St. Vincent and the Grenadines elections, as well as the Venezuelan elections. The ULP, led by Dr. Rav Gonzalez, fourth consecutive term in office. Historic victory for him. There are still questions being asked by the opposition. That's the NDP calling for a recount of votes, especially in the North and South Leeward part of the island. There are allegations of fraud and the like. Of course, the Prime Minister has, in expected fashion, called for unity, for people to come together, for maturity, for the government to get to work, well, for the entire country to get to work on rebuilding, because obviously St. Vincent is suffering a lot of the hardships that we in St. Lucia and the rest of the region are going through. But in terms of his victory, you had the usual things. Every time you have an election in the region, there's a comparison whether the Labour Party here can expect a similar victory. What are the lessons coming out of St. Vincent for us?
First of all, I'm not sure that it is the NDP who is calling for a recount. It was the Prime Minister, the leader of the UPM, Dr. Gonzalez, in his acceptance speech, who called for a recount to the North and South Leeward seats because they were won by the opposition. And his claim, he says the reason he's calling for the recount is because there were more spoilt ballots than the difference between the two the two candidates. So he wanted to determine how the people intended to vote. To vote. So yes, it's historic from the standpoint that it is the first time in CARICOM region in the post-independence period that one has had a political leader winning 4 consecutive elections and a party remaining in government as a result of winning 4 consecutive elections. The margin of victory is not that comfortable. Again, one can look at it 2 ways. Dr. Gonzalez and and his party, they maintained the 1-seat majority that they went into the election with. And in the context of first past the post Westminster approach to politics, you could win by 1 vote, far less by 1 seat.
However, somebody won by 9. Somebody won by 9 votes.
Yeah, by 9 votes. We've got to remember our own situation here, and these are the tricky things about recalls. Sometimes a person calling for the recall ends up losing, as we've seen here. But like I said, the margin of victory between the 2 parties within the parliament is still a 1 seat. And although Dr. Gonzalez found a way in the last 5 years to either avoid or prevent, what every other political leader is afraid of, one of your people crossing the floor, to change the balance of forces and change the government itself. He survived that for 5 years, and he's going into it, and I think his early call for a recount is more within the context of trying to see if they could get those 2 extra seats without going back to an election. Or he would have to take a few pages from Sir John here in 1987. And if he calls another election and say he's uncertain with the thing, and then he gets the same result, then he would have to put out a shopping list or make an invitation in the way that Sir John did. And that is an aspect of politics that is regarded as reprehensible. You contest on 1 seat, you win on 1 party, and then you cross the floor. But then it is also a means and a mechanism that exists within the Westminster democratic structure, where on the basis of your right, your right to be where you consider yourself more comfortable and not necessarily where you were put by the people you asked to put you. So that brings into the whole question of the right to recall. And that is being suggested here within the Constitution. But back to St. Vincent, lessons for us. I think there again, the personality, there are lessons St. Vincent learned from us and we can learn in terms of the personality. For example, leading to the election, there was this tip that was floated, making allegations, using a voice sounding like somebody leading a party.
There were several of them, actually.
Yeah, several of those tapes. And then eventually, on the day before the election, there was this claim that Gonzalez had a multi-million-dollar account somewhere in New York. That didn't seem to work. You know, the effort to paint him black, the effort to paint him as being a sexual predator, the efforts to paint him as being possibly a corrupt leader, those didn't redound well. That only convinced those who were promoting it. But it didn't seem to have the desired effect. And it brings us back to, I've mentioned that before, when the local press ahead of an election made a big issue about the revelation relating to Sir John and a young lady who was not of age to travel with him. That came up just ahead of an election, but it didn't have the effect that it was intended to have, for him to have lost the election. So that again brings us back to the original question of the personality-driven politics. It exists everywhere. Obviously, Vincentians feel more comfortable with Dr. Gonzalez than they would with Mr. Arnim Eustace. And interestingly, one of the founding members of the opposition and former leader of the opposition party, former Prime Minister James Michel from St. Vincent, when he came here to address the UWP convention, he made certain calls here in terms of calling on Mr. Chasney to promise him that he would resign on the same night if the UWP loses. Well, I didn't hear him say that to his leader in St. Vincent, who has lost his third consecutive election, you know, to Dr. Gonzalez, and under whose leadership Dr. Gonzalez has scored, you know, not just a victory, but a record that is going to be hard to beat. Particularly now we're talking about 2-term limits. You know, just recently, one other CARICOM country, I can't remember, the parliament was considering 3 terms as a limit. But the whole question of term limits, rights of recall for people who may cross the floor, rights of recall, it takes us across to another election that also took place this week, last Sunday, in Venezuela. There's another record that has been set there, because for the first time in living memory, recent modern history of Venezuela, you have a president with a an opposition parliamentary majority in the Congress. So given the historical confrontational nature of Venezuelan politics in terms of ever since Chavez, the Chavez era came into play, it has had a fundamental change now from the standpoint that all during Chavez's period and up until now, after his death, over a year after his death, his party was undoubtedly in full control politically, electorally, and administratively. But less than a year later, the Chavez's party is routed. It's got the opposition has a 2/3 majority in parliament. Now the president is still the strongest individual, the most powerful individual in Venezuela by virtue of the constitution. But there again, the whole question of the right of recall. If the majority who voted Maduro president slightly, because he had the lowest margin ever won by his party, if the same people who voted for him and gave him that majority at the presidential election have now turned around and voted 2-1 for the opposition, including the indigenous people who have 3 seats, and which Chavez was an indigenous person and had always had their votes. Even the 3 indigenous votes went to the opposition. So the opposition now has 99 and plus 3, 102. Vis-a-vis 46. So, you know, they have a very commanding lead. So the recall issue is being raised in Venezuela, with the opposition saying, well, the people don't want that president's party. So why should he continue for another 3 years? Because he's going to be president until 2009 because he won a 6-year term. However, the Venezuelan constitution allows for, if there is a 2/3 majority in the parliament, and that majority gets together and exercises the call for a recall, a recall referendum, as they did to Chavez, and he won. But the question is, can Maduro win a recall?
But it'll be very interesting to watch what happens in Venezuela, because you're right, and he's fast approaching the halfway point for his term.
Which is when the recall will come into play.
It is most likely going to happen then. It's almost
in fact, the opposition did indicate on the same night of the victory, that their objective is to remove Chavez, to remove Maduro within the next year. It's because the 3-year, his 3-year halfway point is going to come within the next year.
Yeah, but he's president until 2018. But even if the referendum succeeds and he's removed,
no, he's going to be.
It's required that his vice president fill the post.
Pardon?
It's in constitution, according to the Venezuelan constitution, even if the referendum succeeds in having him removed. My understanding is that his deputy or vice president steps in and performs the role of president until the expiration in 2018.
Well, that again might be the case in terms of what the Constitution says, but in terms of the practical reality, what the opposition want is they want Chavez's party out of the presidency. So I'm not sure, Chavez's party out of the presidency. So if they have a recall that says that Maduro is no longer wanted, I'm not sure that they're going to be satisfied with Maduro's hand-chosen vice president. Yeah, but because he would still be running the show.
What will not happen is that Maduro is going to sit back and allow it to happen. Already we've seen hints, of moves to prevent that from happening. They've announced that they're going to appoint, I think, 12 new Supreme Court judges.
They have done so.
And there's a possibility that he could start implementing laws by decree.
Yeah, but the parliament also can. The parliament can also veto. What you're going to have is a ping pong, because the parliament has the power to veto, to send things back to the president, and the president has the power to veto the parliament. And I think we're going to see a lot of that happening. But Maduro has, in fact, I was reading something where he has, in fact, called on his people to change. He said to them, listen, we have to change our politics. We have to change our perspective. We have to change how we're going about things, because clearly we know, and he, more than everybody else, would know that the temperature has changed. The tempo has changed. And Venezuelans are more interested in seeing their economic and social needs addressed than in building a Bolivarian socialist revolution.
But wasn't that always the case? So it brings me back to the original point that we were discussing about personality-driven politics. They had those same concerns under Chavez, but somehow Chavez was able to stay in power.
Yes,
with
because
the
Chavez,
support of the poor people.
Chavez was a fighter.
Charismatic.
Yeah, his charisma, the fact, and there was that sympathy for Chavez. In that, he had won elections, the army had overthrown him, he was back, he kept winning. He was a winner, a simple guy who was able to translate his policies to people. Maduro is not Chavez. And one of the things he has to realize is that he probably spent too much time trying to be Chavez, trying to show that he is like Chavez, and that is why Chavez handpicked him. I mean, dress like him, talk like him, walk like him, speak like him, address public meetings behind a desk like him. You know, there is a view that he spent too much time trying to explain to people that Chavez is still alive in him. You know, that happens. I mean, in St. Lucia, we still have people who try to speak and sound like George Odlum, you know, rather than being themselves. So that the road ahead in Venezuela is going to be quite interesting. The Bolivarian socialist revolution is at a major road. It's at the traffic light right now, and they have to decide, you know, whether they're going to take the red, the green, or the yellow. But I do see, knowing the PSUV, the ruling party, as I do, they are going to be combative, but one could only hope that they will be more sensible than combative. Because, for example, Maduro has dismissed his government. He has to appoint a new administration. Will he or will he not include opposition parliamentarians or supporters? Will he ask the parliamentary majority to nominate the people to the government? Will he try to build a national unity government? Can that work in Venezuela, where, unlike St. Lucia, where you have a political struggle between two major parties that are hardly seen and treated as different on issues, what you have in Venezuela is an ideological battle where the ruling party wants to build socialism in its own characteristics, with its own Venezuelan characteristics, vis-a-vis an opposition which is saying, no, capitalism is what, you know, has worked here and has worked everywhere, and that's what we need. So will we get cooperation in the true sense of the word between ideological foes?
Yeah, but how realistic is even that expectation when you have division on both sides, the opposition and the government?
Yeah, no, you mean division within?
Within.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, the practicality. But again, what is the other alternative? That Maduro is going to try to carry the revolution alone?
But you know, as I watched the news coming out of Venezuela this week, I couldn't help thinking that maybe the UWP stands a chance after all at the next election, because the opposition succeeded in a 2/3 majority in parliament without putting forth any concrete policies, you know. But
people had turned. And you got to make that assessment. Have people turned?
So we'll see how it develops. It's very interesting developments over in Venezuela. But we're due for a break. Let's take the break. When we come back, we can shift our focus to COP21, which is supposed to wrap up. Was supposed to wrap up on Friday. Should have wrapped up today, but I doubt that's going to happen with any concrete agreement. But we'll see. We'll be right back.